Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. We are so glad to have you here. And today we are going to be talking about MEP data and specifically how to win bids on big tech and data center projects. You guys have probably heard a lot about data centers. It's very much in the news right now, learning about some of these big data centers that are under construction. And we are really interested in how those data centers are going to be measuring their carbon footprint. So I am joined today by Spencer Jarrett. He is an EPD and LCA expert here at One Click LCA. So thank you for joining me today, Spencer.
Yeah, hey, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining.
And we'll get into the conversation here pretty quickly. But in case you are not familiar with One Click LCA, we are the world's leading software for construction and manufacturing sustainability. And we provide the easy to use LCA and EPD platform with all of the world's data and integrations. We have solutions for over 80 different global standards and regulations. We have the world's largest LCA database with over 300,000 data sets. And our software integrates with over 20 of the other softwares that you guys know and love, things like Revit, Rhino, Grasshopper, and more. So we've been powering the makers of a zero carbon future for over 20 years, and we're really excited to have you here with us today to talk about this timely issue. So without too much more of an introduction, I'm going to hand it over to Spencer, who's going to go through our presentation today. But we will be doing a live Q&A at the end. So if you are, want to know more about what Spencer's talking about, if you have questions about MEP data or data centers in general, EPDs, what AEC professionals need to be doing with EPDs, go ahead and put those questions in the questions tab or in the chat. We'll be monitoring those as the presentation goes on. And then when we get to the end, we'll have some time for a live Q&A and Spencer will be able to answer all of your questions. So definitely drop those in the chat. And without any more introductions, Spencer, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Aileen, and thank you all for joining us. Before we get into some of the specifics about the MEP components that go into data centers, I just want to set the stage a little bit for uh, where the industry's at in terms of actually accounting for embodied carbon in MEP components within the built environment, and what the demand looks like right now and in the future in terms of data centers, and what the impacts of MEP are within those data centers. So, firstly, I want to highlight MEP 2040. MEP 2040 is an industry initiative, primarily of MEP engineering and consulting firms, and basically, the firms that are a part of the initiative have pledged to reach net zero embodied carbon for their designs by 2040. Um, and earlier this year, just a few months ago, the group published a first of its kind study uh, analyzing the MEP embodied carbon impacts uh, of everything that went into a University of Illinois um, campus building. And so what you're seeing here on the screen is the actual breakout on the left of just looking at the MEP materials, uh, which category contributed most to the embodied carbon impact, and then just to the right of that, how that stacked up against all the other components that went into that building. So in that particular study, uh, MEP actually um, took up a majority of the embodied carbon impact. And that was just for a campus building at University of Illinois, not a data center. So just to provide a little context, you can imagine what the embodied carbon impacts of MEP components in a data center, which is much more um, heavily designed from an MEP perspective, could be. So if you haven't looked up MEP 2040, I encourage you go ahead and Google it now. The case study is on there explaining exactly how the group went through quantifying the impacts, and there's some good benchmark values in there that you can use as well. And we at One Click LCA actually supported that study and were a part of it. So please go and check that out just as a starting point to see how you can begin quantifying these impacts. So now I want to shift the conversation here into what the demand looks like for data centers right now and in the near future. So to really drive this point home, I have a screenshot here from Mark Zuckerberg, who pasted the footprint of one of their upcoming data center builds over the island of Manhattan. So you can see just from one data center how massive the footprint of it can be. And on this next slide, this is from NREL. You can see the data centers that are already operational in the US in yellow, and then the ones that are under construction in orange, those orange dots around the map here, and then the white ones are planned. So you can see there are some pretty large white dots on the West Coast and East Coast for upcoming data centers. So keep in mind, this is one data center here. There will be many of these across the country that are going to be entering design and construction very soon. So what does that mean in terms of the materials that go into those data centers? Well, I have a really simple graph here just to illustrate from a gross floor area perspective what the footprint of all of these data centers will be. And these bars here are scaled based on the power density, so watts per square foot. A good rule of thumb for data centers is that they'll be using anywhere between 100 watts to 300 watts per square foot. So just doing some quick math, looking at the planned data centers that are upcoming and their capacity in terms of power usage, we can pretty well see there's going to be tens of millions of square footage in data centers that are built over the next couple of years. So not even talking about MEP here, just massive footprint in terms of the buildings that will hold all of this equipment. So the next thing I want to highlight here is just procurement that's shifting both in the US and globally. So several states have already rolled out their buy clean guidelines. And I know the GSA has kind of been put on pause in terms of providing more guidance and funding to create EPDs, but several states have already started to release their own guidance for actually documenting the embodied carbon impact of materials. Right now, the Buy Clean Act states have excluded MEP, and that's mainly driven by the lack of EPDs and data around MEP equipment, which is what this whole webinar is about, is actually putting some of that data out there for designers, for developers to actually use and weigh as they're considering new builds and as they have to document their impacts, which brings me to the next two bullets there. California has its own legislation requiring full GHG accounting for businesses of a certain size doing business in the state of California, which impacts pretty much every big tech company that will be building or has already built data centers. So come 2026, they will have to actually quantify their scope 3 emissions, which is where all of the equipment that goes into a data center, MEP equipment, will be captured. So there's a big gap in the industry now in terms of data, but it is going to need to be filled and filled very fast. So the next section of the presentation here will get into the actual materials and equipment components that go into a data center. A lot of life cycle assessments for buildings currently is excluding MEP components. So you can think of like LEED guidelines right now does not include any MEP components. Well, in a data center, that is far outnumbering the number of structural and envelope components in terms of just the mass of material that you'll have on site. So what we're thinking about in MEP are air conditioning units for server rooms, for computer rooms, racks, uninterrupted power generators for backup power, chillers, liquid cooling for the actual components in the server room, fire suppression. Those are the things that we're talking about here, and just have some illustrations here on the next couple of slides. So basically, everything that actually goes into the server rooms or that enters the server room on a data center is what we're looking at here. And I kind of already mentioned quite a few of these generators, cables, jacks, fire suppression, cooling towers, ductwork, fans, pumps, etc. All of these things are what we are going to need to start quantifying in order to meet those regulatory requirements on the earlier slide. And just a few more photos here to illustrate what some of these materials actually look like. So in the top left here we have power distribution unit. On the right we have backup generators outside of a data center. And the two images below are showing liquid cooling, and the one on the right is more of a diagram showing sort of how some of these systems link up and actually enter the service room. And you can see some of the rooftop units there on the bottom right image. So this slide is focusing a little bit more on some systems that are probably most overlooked in general when it comes to MEP and especially data centers. So all of the supporting materials that actually guide the cables to where they're going, cable trays, racks, even the jack ports where the cables actually enter the racks. All of those things right now are relatively unquantified in terms of their environmental impact, and you can only imagine how many of those things will be going in a data center that's the size of Manhattan. And fire suppression is another one. Data centers have some advanced systems that use gas to stop fires, and some of them are using misting sprinklers or just regular sprinklers. But there's a lot more design and more components that go into fire suppression for a data center, because if a fire does occur, the idea is to minimize the damage both from the fire and from the suppression to keep that data center operational and live. So just to wrap up that little section there, the main point is that MEP equipment and materials are a huge amount of the materials that go into data centers, and right now they're a blind spot. And if you're a company that needs to comply with the upcoming regulations in California, those in Europe that already exist, at some point you're going to have to quantify what the embodied carbon impacts of that MEP equipment is. And if you don't have that EPD or some metric to provide, you're probably going to start being excluded from bids, from being considered for those projects. So let's talk about, just for 1 second, what is an EPD? An EPD is essentially, it's an environmental product declaration. That's what EPD stands for. And it is basically giving us the environmental impact of one particular material or piece of equipment. So think about it like the nutritional facts for a single fire sprinkler head or a single computer room AC unit? What was the impact to actually harvest the materials and build that unit up to the point of actually delivering it to the data center project? That is what an EPD is. It's a third-party verified document, so it provides transparency to the public, to those data center owners and other stakeholders, to the government even in some of these cases, as to what the impacts are of that product. So it's the full transparent carbon metric that you'll need to provide for each piece of equipment. And I know this entire presentation is focused mainly on embodied carbon. We could do a whole nother presentation on operational carbon, because these data centers are using so much energy, so much water. That is without a doubt the first metric that's being weighed whenever equipment's being chosen. But it doesn't change the fact that actually understanding the embodied carbon impacts will be required, or they already are being required if you are in some regions. But just thinking about some of the synergies, one that I'll just point out that I think is most important for MEP life cycle assessments are replacements and refurbishment impacts. So with the lifespan of a lot of these data centers, a lot of the MEP equipment will need to be replaced well before the time that that data center is decommissioned or torn down. So think about just a single computer room air conditioning unit. It could last, depending on how hard it's working and maintenance, it can last anywhere between 12 to 25 years. So just thinking about some of those recurring embodied carbon impacts that could pop up over the entire lifespan of that building will become very important when weighing operational versus embodied versus some of that maintenance and replacement that needs to occur. So just to recap this section here, what happens without an EPD? You're really leaving those data center owners who have to report their Scope 3 emissions at a loss, which could in turn limit or prohibit your ability as a MEP manufacturer to actually bid or be considered for those projects. So need to have the EPD. Having just the life cycle assessment is definitely a start, but saying you've had a third party verify the arithmetic and the overall impact of your product is really what the government, what data center owners are looking for. So how can we at One Click LCA help? We have a specific tool just for MEP equipment that is end-to-end, meaning that if you need to assess, let's say, one of those computer room units or a rooftop unit or a light fixture or a generator, something like that, you can assess the entire product within One Click LCA and actually send the LCA once it's complete to the third party to be verified and published. And then you can iterate this process quickly and begin to automate it if you need to start assessing different variants of the same piece of equipment or other product lines of whatever component might make up the system that you're assessing. And when it comes to actually proving the ROI on your EPDs as you begin to make and publish them, and really seeing who is looking at your EPDs, how they're being utilized, where they're being utilized, those are all things that you can do in One Click LCA as well. So what you're seeing on the screen here is the materials compass tool on One Click LCA, which is a tool that almost all users are using now. It's easy to search EPD library where developers, owners, MEP design engineers are going in to survey what EPDs exist and what data they can get a hold of to start quantifying some of these impacts and getting to the point where they're actually comparing different equipment or maybe the same piece of equipment between manufacturers that have an EPD. They're doing all of that within the materials compass. And as a manufacturer, you can set up your own page within the compass to market a specific product, to set up a section where those specifiers can actually come and contact you directly. And because we have so many users on the AEC design side of the platform, we can actually provide some real-time analytics as to who is looking at your products, what sorts of projects that they're looking at them in. So this whole presentation is focused on data centers, but you would have the ability to see, are designers and specifiers pulling my EPD into a healthcare project, or is it a life science project, whatever it may be. Those are the kind of real-time analytics and feedback that we can go ahead and provide. And you can see some of the different graphical options there on the screen that you can use to see all of those analytics, to maybe reach out to some of those developers, or they can reach out directly to you through the materials compass for a quote or for more technical information about your EPD. So last two slides here, just to wrap up for the manufacturers on the call. These bullet points are some of the parameters that you need to think about when we start to make an EPD or conduct an LCA. These are the exact parameters that we would go through with you if you wanted to work with us at One Click LCA or use our software to produce an EPD. This is exactly where we would start. Now, there's a lot of sub bullets that could go underneath all of these, but in general, these are the parameters and the metrics that we need to be aware of as we begin the inventory process and actually conducting an LCA on your product. So just to wrap up here before I hand it back over to you, Aileen, just want to use this as a call to action to all of the manufacturers here. Go ahead and get started with at least collecting some of the data on the previous screen. Start thinking about, do you have the resources in place to start creating EPDs? Maybe you currently have some customers that are already asking for EPDs ahead of some of these regulations, or maybe you're doing projects in Europe or elsewhere where you already need to have EPDs in place. So if you're not being asked now, you definitely will be within the next couple of years, at least here in the United States. So now is a great time to get started. And Aileen, I will pass it back over to you.
Perfect. Thank you for that answer. As you guys are probably aware, we focused on data. Well, Spencer focused on data centers in this presentation because they are they're going to have such a huge impact in the next few years, and they are so MEP intensive. But as regulations evolve and as states are requiring more and more of this data for data centers, that is going to trickle down and apply to all kinds of projects. So it's really important to get ahead of the curve here. And like Spencer said, go ahead and get started now, because codes are going to start making EPDs mandatory. We are seeing the market move forward, and market demands are continuing to demand sustainability. So, which we love to see, of course. Now, we're going to jump into the Q&A in just a second. I do have a few questions that came in through the questions tab. But before that, I wanted to put up a question for you and see if any of you are interested in booking a demo with One Click LCA. I'm going to add the poll on the screen. I do apologize. I hit the wrong button and now something is loading. So it may take a second, but I will be, here we go. There. So now you should see a poll on your screen asking if you would like a free demo with One Click LCA. Whether you're a manufacturer looking to create an EPD for your product, your MEP product or otherwise, or if you are an AEC professional who's joining us today and you want to learn more about how you can use the materials compass to find products. Maybe you want to use the manufacturer pages if you're a manufacturer. All of those questions we'll be happy to demonstrate to you if you would like to book a free demonstration. And now you can just answer that poll as it comes up on your screen. And now we'll jump into the questions. So let me just change this. If you do want to contact Spencer, you can feel free to scan that QR code that's on the screen that will put you directly in touch with him. But Spencer, one question that came in, which is what impact data is available in One Click LCA to use for a product LCA or creating an EPD?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll answer the product LCA and EPD part of that. So within One Click LCA, there are about 20 generic emissions profile databases that you can pull from. EcoInvent is one of the most popular ones, but there are 20 different databases that you could utilize there, in addition to any existing EPDs that are already out there, not just in the U.S. but in globally. You can utilize any of those EPDs or other generic data in your product LCA. Or if you have your own data that isn't public about a certain manufacturing process or ingredient material for the product you're assessing, you can also input your own private data as long as you have at least the GWP value, but ideally all of the Tracy impact categories as well.
Great, perfect, thank you. Now, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but how do you account for components that are typically high turnover? So you mentioned that a lot of MEP products have a higher turnover than the lifespan of a building, but some of these components are sort of have an even higher turnover rate than you might expect, especially like this person mentioned computer room AC units. So how do you account for such a high turnover in places like data centers?
Well, within the product LCA, that would be accounted for anything that's operationally being used or using some kind of energy over its lifespan. So within actually conducting an LCA and within our software where you can do that, you can input the specific year that individual components would need to be replaced, or if they don't need to be replaced, they just need to be refurbished in some way. You can input that as well, both at a product level and at a whole data center LCA level. But the product LCAs themselves should have that information in there about what is the typical service life, what kind of maintenance needs to be done, and all of those things should be in there for you to consider.
Great, perfect. And then we have one more question, which is how do you handle uncertainty in environmental impacts for some of that equipment that doesn't have an EPD or doesn't have any carbon data? Like you said, we're missing a lot of data in MEP. it's a blind spot because we're not measuring it, but it's also a blind spot because there's no EPDs. But how do you handle that uncertainty?
Yeah, I assume that question came from someone more on the AEC side, who's actually looking at the entire data center, whole building. But that is one of the hard parts of doing MEP LCA right now because of the lack of data. There are other databases that exist that don't look at the entire life cycle that in the same way we would to do an LCA, like TM65 data. There is quite a few of European EPDs that exist for a lot of MEP equipment that you could use as a proxy and try and localize that material to the US, which is another thing that you have the ability to do within One Click LCA. But lastly, I would say use the MEP 2040 Foundation Guide as a reference. Within the guide, there are some generic values or sort of benchmark values that you can use for materials that here in the US we don't have that data for. So you can use those, in lieu of not having what you need. And then after all that, you can, write your manufacturer and ask them to get started on an EPD so you don't have to guess.
Perfect. Well, that is, those are all of our questions for today. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And thank you so much, Spencer, for this presentation. I'm sure that we'll be talking more about MEP and especially data centers in the coming months and especially next year. So thank you so much for your time and insights today, Spencer.
Yeah, of course. Thank you all for joining.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for joining us. And if you are interested in learning more, you can always visit us at oneclicklca.com, and we will see you on the next webinar. Thanks so much.